music of the spheres, and defining the tethered orbits of the planets, when McSnagley impressively arose. "Lissy, you were speaking of the revolutions of this year yearth and the movements of the sun, and I think you said it had been a doing of it since the creation, Mliss nodded a scornful affirmative. "Well, war that the truth?" said McSnagley, folding his arms. "Yes," said Mliss, shutting up her little red lips tightly. The handsome outlines at the windows peered further in the schoolroom, and a saintly Raphael face with blond beard and soft blue eyes, belonging to the biggest scamp in the diggings, turned toward the child and whispered, "Stick to it, Mliss." The reverend gentleman heaved a deep sigh, and cast a compassionate glance at the master, then at the children, and then rested his look on Clytie. That young woman softly elevated her round white arm. Its seductive curves were enhanced by a gorgeous and massive specimen bracelet, the gift of one of her humblest worshippers, worn in honor of the occasion. There was a momentary silence. Clytie's round cheeks were very pink and soft. Clytie's big eyes were very bright and blue. Clytie's low-necked white book muslin rested softly on Clytie's white plump shoulders. Clytie looked at the master, and the master nodded. Then Clytie spoke softly. "Joshua commanded the sun to stand still, and it obeyed him." There was a low hum of applause in the schoolroom, a triumphant expression on McSnagley's face, a grave shadow on the master's, and a comical look of disappointment reflected from the windows. Mliss skimmed rapidly over astronomy, and then shut the book with a loud snap. A groan burst from McSnagley, an expression of astonishment from the schoolroom, a yell from the windows as Mliss brought her red fist down on the desk with the emphatic declaration, "It's a damn lie! I don't believe it!" Chapter 4. The long wet season had drawn near its close. Signs of spring were visible in the swelling buds and rushing torrents. The pine forests exhaled the fresher spicery. The azaleas were already budding, the ceanothus getting ready its lilac livery for spring. On the green upland which climbed Red Mountain at its southern aspect, the long spike of the monkshood shot up from its broad-leaved stool, and once more shook its dark blue bells. Again the billow above Smith's grave was soft and green, its crest just tossed with the foam of daisies and buttercups. The little graveyard had gathered a few new dwellers in the past year, and the mounds were placed 2 by 2 by the little paling until they reached Smith's grave, and there was but one. General superstition had shunned it, and the plot beside Smith was vacant. There had been several placards posted about the town, intimating that, at a certain period, a celebrated dramatic company would perform for a few days a series of side-splitting and screaming farces; that, alternating pleasantly with this, there would be some melodrama and a grand divertisement which would include singing, dancing, etc. These announcements occasioned a great fluttering among the little folk, and were the theme of much excitement and great speculation among the master's scholars. The master had promised Mliss, to whom this sort of thing was sacred and rare, that she should go, and on that momentous evening the master and Mliss assisted. The performance was the prevalent style of heavy mediocrity. The melodrama was not bad enough to laugh at, nor good enough to excite. But the master, turning wearily to the child, was astonished, and felt something like self-accusation in noticing the peculiar effect upon her excitable nature. The red blood flushed in her cheeks at each stroke of her panting little heart. Her small passionate lips were slightly parted to give vent to a hurried breath. Her widely opened lids threw up and arched her black eyebrows. She did not laugh at the dismal comicalities of the funny man, for Mliss seldom laughed; nor was she discreetly affected to the delicate extremes of the corner of a white handkerchief, as was the tender-hearted Clytie, who was talking with her fellow and ogling the master at the same moment. But when the performance was over, and the green curtain fell on the little stage, Mliss drew a long deep breath, and turned to the master's grave face with a half-apologetic smile and weary gesture. Then she said, "Now take me home," and dropped the lids of her black eyes, as if to dwell once more in fancy on the mimic stage. On their way to Mrs. Morphe's, the master thought proper to ridicule the whole performance. Now he shouldn't wonder if Mliss thought that the young lady who acted so beautifully was really in earnest, and in love with a gentleman who wore such fine clothes. Well, if she were in love with him, it was a very unfortunate thing. "Why?" said Mliss, with an upward sweep of the drooping lid. "Oh, well, he couldn't support his wife with his present salary, and pay so much a week for his fine clothes, and then they wouldn't receive as much wages if they were married as if they were merely lovers, that is," added the master, "if they are not already married to somebody else. But I think the husband of the pretty young countess takes the tickets at the door, or pulls up the curtain, or snuffs the candles, or does something equally refined and elegant. As to the young man with nice clothes, which are really nice now, and must cost at least $2.50 or $3, not to speak of that mantle of red drugget which I happen to know the price of, for I bought some of it for my room once. As to this young man, Lissy, he's a pretty good fellow, and if he does drink occasionally, I don't think people ought to take advantage of it and give him black eyes and throw him in the mud. Do you? I'm sure he might owe me $2.50 a long time before I would throw it up in his face, as the fellow did the other night at Wingdam." Mliss had taken his hand in both of hers, and was trying to look in his eyes, which the young man kept as resolutely averted. Mliss had a faint idea of irony, indulging herself sometimes in a species of sardonic humour, which was equally visible in her actions and her speech. But the young man continued in this strain until they had reached Mrs. Morpher's, and he had deposited Mliss in her maternal charge. Waving the invitation of Mrs. Morpher to refreshment and rest, and shading his eyes with his hand to keep out the blue-eyed Clytemnestra's siren glances, he excused himself and went home. For 2 or 3 days after the advent of the dramatic company, Mliss was late at school, and the master's usual Friday afternoon ramble was for once omitted, owing to the absence of his trustworthy guide. As he was putting away his books and preparing to leave the schoolhouse, a small voice piped at his side. "Please, sir?" The master turned, and there stood Aristides Morpher. "Well, my little man," said the master, impatiently, "what is it? Quick!" "Please, sir, me and Kirk think that Mliss is going to run away again." "What's that, sir?" said the master, with that unjust testiness with which we always receive disagreeable news. "Why, sir, she don't stay home any more, and Kirk and me see her talking with one of those actor fellows, and she's with him now. And please, sir, yesterday she told Kirk and me she could make a speech as well as Miss Celestina Montmorency, and she spouted right off by heart." And the little fellow paused in a collapsed condition. "What actor?" asked the master. "Him as wears the shiny hat, and hair, and gold pin, and gold chain," said the just Aristides, putting periods for commas to eke out his breath. The master put on his gloves and hat, feeling an unpleasant tightness in his chest and thorax, and walked out in the road. Aristides trotted along by his side, endeavouring to keep pace with his short legs to the master's strides, when the master stopped suddenly, and Aristides bumped up against him. "Where were they talking?" asked the master, as if continuing the conversation. "At the arcade," said Aristides. When they reached the main street, the master paused. "Run down home," said he to the boy. "If Mliss is there, come to the arcade and tell me. If she isn't there, stay home. Run!" And off trotted the short-legged Aristides. The arcade was just across the way, a long rambling building containing a bar-room, billiard-room, and restaurant. As the young man crossed the plaza, he noticed that 2 or 3 of the passers-by turned and looked after him. He looked at his clothes, took out his handkerchief, and wiped his face before he entered the bar-room. It contained the usual number of loungers, who stared at him as he entered. One of them looked at him so fixedly and with such a strange expression that the master stopped and looked again, and then saw it was only his own reflection in a large mirror. This made the master think that perhaps he was a little excited, and so he took up a copy of the Red Mountain Banner from one of the tables and tried to recover his composure by reading the column of advertisements. He then walked through the bar-room, through the restaurant, and into the billiard-room. The child was not there. In the latter apartment a person was standing by one of the tables with a broad-brimmed glazed hat on his head. The master recognized him as the agent of the dramatic company. He had taken a dislike to him at their first meeting, from the peculiar fashion of wearing his beard and hair. Satisfied that the object of his search was not there, he turned to the man with the glazed hat. He had noticed the master, but tried that common trick of unconsciousness in which vulgar natures always fail. Balancing a billiard cue in his hand, he pretended to play with a ball in the centre of the table. The master stood opposite to him until he raised his eyes. When their glances met, the master walked up to him. He had intended to avoid a scene or quarrel, but when he began to speak, something kept rising in his throat and retarded his utterance, and his own voice frightened him. It sounded so distant, low, and resonant. "I understand," he began, that Melissa Smith, an orphan and one of my scholars, has talked with you about adopting your profession.